The sun was low in the sky, burning orange over the wide desert land. The small frontier town sat quiet but not peaceful. Dust rose with the hot wind, carrying with it the sound of wagon wheels, boots, and horses tied outside the saloon. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and secrets never stayed hidden for long. On this day, though, there was no normal gossip. There was only one subject on everyone's lips: the young Apache woman who had been taken as a prisoner after the raid near the river. The townsfolk were gathered in little knots outside the sheriff's office, whispering and pointing, waiting for judgment. Some were curious, some were afraid, and some were angry. They had been told the Apache woman was dangerous, a thief, even a killer. But none of them had actually seen her do anything. Still, fear made them believe what they were told. It was easier to treat her as guilty than to ask questions. That was the way things often went in towns like this, where power was held not by the weak but by the loudest and wealthiest voices. Inside the sheriff's office, Sheriff Thomas Carver sat at his desk, his hat tilted back slightly, staring at the iron bars of the cell. Behind them sat the young Apache woman. Her hands were tied in front of her with rough rope, but her back was straight, her chin lifted high. She did not cry, did not beg, did not even glance at the sheriff unless he spoke to her. Her dark eyes, deep like the desert night, held a quiet strength that unsettled him. She was no ordinary prisoner, he thought. There was something about the way she carried herself, even in chains, that made her seem freer than most people outside these walls. Carver rubbed his temples. He had worn the badge for 10 years, and in that time he had seen all kinds of people pass through his jail: drifters, thieves, outlaws, men who thought too much of their guns. He had heard lies and excuses, seen tears and anger. But this woman was different. She had not said much since being brought in, only that her name was Naya. When the deputy had tried to force her to give more answers, she had remained silent, and Carver had ordered him to stop. Something inside told him it wasn't right to treat her with cruelty. She was not like the outlaws who swaggered in with pride in their crimes. There was dignity in her silence. But Carver's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of boots stomping on the wooden floor. The office door swung open, and in walked Mr. Harlan, the land baron who owned half the town and nearly all the ranch land for miles. He was a large man with a red face and a wide mustache, his clothes fine compared to the dusty townsfolk. He did not wait for permission to speak. "Sheriff," Harlan said, his voice booming, "you know what must be done. That Apache girl cannot stay here. She is a danger and the people are uneasy. We must be rid of her. There are men who would pay well for her labor down south. You deliver her, you keep the peace, and you prove to this town that you can uphold the law." Carver stayed quiet for a moment. He did not like the way Harlan spoke, as if the decision was already made. He leaned back in his chair and studied the man. "She hasn't been given a trial," Carver said slowly. "No one has proven she did what they say." Harlan's face hardened. "Trial? What trial? You think the people will sit and waste time on that? Her kind have caused enough trouble already. You want bloodshed in the streets? No, we must act fast. I'll have a buyer ready by tomorrow." Carver looked past Harlan to the cell. Naya sat still, her expression unchanged, though her eyes flickered briefly toward him as if testing his spirit. He felt an unease stir in his chest. He had sworn to serve justice when he first put on the badge. Justice was not about money or keeping men like Harlan happy. But justice also meant keeping the town from tearing itself apart. He was caught in the middle, and the weight of it pressed heavy on his shoulders. After Harlan left, slamming the door behind him, Carver stayed seated for a long time. He thought about his father, who had raised him with strict lessons about right and wrong. His father used to say, "A man's worth is not measured by the laws he follows, but by the truth he upholds when no one is watching." Those words had guided Carver many times before. But tonight those words made him feel trapped. He knew the truth. The Apache woman had not been proven guilty. But the law, twisted by men like Harlan, demanded her punishment anyway. The night grew darker and the town grew louder. Carver could hear shouts and laughter from the saloon, but beneath it he also heard anger. People wanted action. They wanted to see him obey. They wanted to know the sheriff stood on their side. And if he did not, he knew how quickly the same voices could turn against him. A sheriff without the trust of his town was no sheriff at all. In the cell, Naya finally spoke. Her voice was calm and low, but strong enough to carry across the room. "Why do you listen to them?" she asked. Carver turned his head, surprised. Until now she had spoken only a few words. You wear the star. Does it not mean truth? Or do you serve the man with money? Her words cut sharper than any blade. Carver felt the sting of shame. He tried to respond, but no answer came. She turned her gaze back to the ground as if she already knew his silence was an answer. Carver stood up suddenly and walked out into the night, needing the cool air to clear his thoughts. The streets were nearly empty now, lanterns glowing faintly in the windows. He walked slowly, boots kicking dust, hands clenched at his sides. He remembered his early days as a young deputy, when he had believed in the badge as a symbol of fairness. But now it felt like a weight dragging him down. The faces of the townsfolk flashed in his mind, expecting him to deliver the woman like a piece of cattle. He thought of Harlan, rich and powerful, who would crush him like an insect if he resisted. Then he thought of Naya, sitting in silence, unbroken even in chains, and for the first time in years, Sheriff Carver wondered if the law he served was truly the law of justice, or just the law of men. By the time he returned to the office, the moon was high. He found Naya still awake, watching him with steady eyes. He stood by the bars, unsure of what to say. She broke the silence again. You do not have to fear me. I will not beg you. My spirit is free even if you keep my body here. But one day when you look at yourself in the glass, you will know whether you are a man of truth or a man of chains. Her words echoed in the small room. Carver felt his chest tighten. For the first time since he had put on the badge, he wondered if he could lose everything and still find something greater. He walked back to his desk, sat down heavily, and leaned his head into his hands. The decision was not made yet, but deep inside a seed had been planted. A seed of defiance, of courage, of something more powerful than fear. The night stretched on, and the sheriff stayed awake, wrestling with his thoughts, while the young Apache woman sat silently in the cell, strong as stone. And though the town slept, a storm was already beginning to rise inside the heart of the man sworn to protect it. The next morning, the town woke restless. News traveled fast in a place so small, and everyone knew that Sheriff Carver held the Apache woman in his jail. Men gathered outside the office, whispering in sharp voices while women peered through windows, their faces tense. Even children could sense that something was brewing, though they did not understand what it was. The town seemed like a pot left too long on the fire, ready to boil over. Sheriff Carver had not slept much. He sat at his desk with a cold cup of coffee, staring at papers he could not read. Every so often he lifted his head and looked at the cell. Naya was still there, calm as she had been the night before. Her silence was louder than the crowd outside. It made him uneasy. Most prisoners pleaded, argued, or cursed. She simply sat, her back straight, her hands folded loosely in her lap. It was as though she knew something he did not. The door slammed open again, and his deputy, young Frank Miller, came in red-faced. Sheriff, the people want action. They're saying you're dragging your feet. Some are saying you've gone soft. Frank was only 22, eager to prove himself, but too quick to let fear turn into anger. If you don't hand her over soon, I reckon they'll start thinking you're on her side. Carver sighed and leaned back. Frank, the law's not about rushing because people shout the loudest. Frank scowled. With respect, Sheriff, you know Harlan won't stand for delay. He's already promised the buyer down south. If we stand in his way, we'll both be out of jobs, maybe worse. The sheriff looked at him, his tired eyes steady. Frank, have you ever asked yourself if Harlan's word is the same as the law? The deputy shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer. He muttered something about checking the street and hurried out. Carver knew the boy was scared. Truth be told, so was he. Later that morning, Harlan himself arrived again, riding a fine horse that kicked dust into the crowd. He climbed down heavily and pushed through the people with the air of a man who owned not just land, but the very souls who lived on it. He entered the sheriff's office without knocking, as always. Well, Sheriff, Harlan said, pulling off his gloves, today's the day. I've got men ready to take the girl. Best you bring her out and hand her over. It'll settle things nice and clean. Carver stayed seated, not moving a muscle. You ever think, Harlan, what if she's not guilty? Harlan barked a laugh. Not guilty? Don't be a fool. She's Apache. That's guilt enough for half the town. Besides, what's it matter? She'll fetch a price. That's more than she's worth rotting in your cell. Naya's eyes lifted at that. For the first time since dawn, she spoke. You talk as though land and people are the same, to be bought and sold. But the land will not always be yours. One day it will rise against you. The room grew quiet. Harlan's face turned dark and he stepped toward the bars. You watch your tongue, girl. Carver stood then, placing himself between Harlan and the cell. His voice was calm but firm. That's enough. For a moment the two men stared at each other. Carver felt the weight of every eye outside pressing through the walls. He knew Harlan would not forgive this, but he did not step aside. Finally, Harlan sneered, put on his gloves again, and turned for the door. You'll regret crossing me, Sheriff. The town needs law, not mercy. Remember that. When he left, the silence in the office was heavy. Carver walked slowly back to his desk. His heart beat hard, but he tried not to show it. He knew that by protecting her, even in that small way, he had already taken his first step down a dangerous road. By afternoon, the tension in town had thickened. Groups of men gathered outside the saloon, speaking in low tones, glancing toward the jail. A few came to the office door to shout that the sheriff should do his duty. One even threw a stone through the window, shattering the glass. Carver picked up the rock in his hand, feeling the rough edges, and set it on his desk. It was a warning. Inside the cell, Naya finally broke her silence again. Why do they listen to him? She asked, meaning Harlan. Carver looked at her, tired but curious. Because he's rich. Because he owns the land they work. Because fear is easier than truth. She studied him a moment, then nodded. And what do you own, Sheriff? The question struck him harder than the stone through the window. He wanted to say he owned his badge, his name, his honor, but he wasn't sure anymore. The badge felt like a chain. His name was being dragged through the mud, and his honor. His honor was what he was still trying to hold on to. That night, Carver walked through the town, keeping his eyes open. He heard voices in the saloon, men calling him weak, some saying he was protecting the Apache for reasons they didn't understand. The whispers followed him wherever he went. He felt the weight of judgment pressing down harder than ever. When he returned to the jail, he found Naya still awake. She had not touched the food he had left. She simply sat in quiet strength. Carver pulled up a chair and sat across from the bars. You don't eat? He asked. I eat when I am free, she said softly. Carver felt a lump rise in his throat. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling. You know, if I don't hand you over, I could lose everything. My badge, my job, maybe even my life. She looked at him steadily. Then you must ask yourself, what is worth more? The badge on your chest or the truth in your heart? Her words stayed with him long after she fell silent again. He sat in the dim light of the lantern, thinking about every decision that had brought him here. He remembered when he first put on the star, how proud his father had been. He remembered chasing outlaws through the desert, bringing them back to face justice. He remembered how right it had felt to stand for law and order. But now the law had twisted. The law no longer felt like truth. It felt like chains, heavy and cold. Carver rose and walked to the bars. He studied Naya carefully. She was young, but her eyes carried years of hardship, and yet there was no bitterness there, only strength. He realized then that she was braver than he was. She had nothing left to lose, and yet she still spoke of truth. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the empty streets. It rattled loose shutters and blew dust against the windows. Carver felt as though the land itself was warning him that a storm was coming. He knew the next day would bring greater pressure, greater danger. The town was ready to see blood or profit, and Harlan would not stop until he got what he wanted. As Carver sat back down, he understood one thing clearly. He was standing at a line. On one side was obedience, safety, and surrender to Harlan's will. On the other side was risk, danger, and maybe ruin, but also truth. He did not know yet which side he would step toward, but deep down, he felt his heart already leaning. The night dragged on, filled with uneasy silence, broken only by the sound of boots pacing across the wooden floor. Sheriff Carver wrestled with his doubts, while in the cell the Apache woman sat calm and unbroken, like a flame that refused to die out. The town might demand her downfall, but her spirit was not theirs to claim. And in the quiet hours before dawn, Carver began to see that his own spirit was not Harlan's to command either. The morning sun rose over the desert, its light painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The town awoke early, the people restless after a night of rumors and talk. Word spread that today would be the day Sheriff Carver decided the fate of the Apache woman. Some believed he would finally obey Harlan and hand her over. Others whispered that he was stalling because he had doubts. Either way, the air was thick with tension, like the moment before a storm. Sheriff Carver had not slept again. He sat at his desk staring at the badge lying on the table. The five-pointed star had once filled him with pride, but now it seemed to mock him. He picked it up, turned it over in his hand, and set it down again. Every decision he had made in his years of service had been guided by the belief that the law was fair. But now he saw that the law was sometimes bent, twisted by men with money and power. Naya sat in the cell, quiet as always, but her eyes followed him. Carver could feel the weight of her gaze. It was not the look of someone begging for mercy. It was the look of someone testing whether a man would stand for what was right. That gaze was heavier than Harlan's threats, heavier than the anger of the townsfolk outside. By mid-morning, Harlan returned, this time with two of his hired men. They were tall, rough men with hard eyes, carrying rifles slung over their shoulders. The townsfolk gathered quickly, crowding the street, eager to see what would happen. Harlan stepped forward with his usual arrogance, his voice loud enough for all to hear. "Sheriff," he called, "the time for waiting is over. Bring out the prisoner. I have men ready to take her. If you hesitate any longer, you'll have more trouble than you can handle." Carver stood in the doorway of the office, blocking the view of the cell. His hand rested on the doorframe, steady though his heart was pounding. "She hasn't been tried," he said firmly. "She hasn't been proven guilty of anything," the crowd murmured, shifting uneasily. Harlan raised his voice. "What proof do you need?" "She's Apache. They raided our lands, burned our homes. You want to protect her? You want to side with the enemy?" Carver's jaw tightened. "I'm not siding with anyone. I'm saying the truth matters, and the truth is she hasn't done what you claim." Harlan stepped closer, his face red with anger. "Do you think the people care about truth? They want safety. They want order. If you won't give it, then I'll take it." The two hired men stepped forward as if ready to push past the sheriff. The crowd grew louder, some shouting for Carver to step aside, others urging him to hold his ground. For a moment it seemed the whole town might explode into chaos. Carver lifted his hand. His voice was calm but carried over the noise. "You hired me to keep peace in this town. That's what I'll do. But peace built on lies is no peace at all." The words silenced the crowd. For a moment all that could be heard was the wind blowing dust across the street. Harlan glared at him, his mustache twitching with rage. Then he spat on the ground and turned sharply away. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You'll lose everything." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, his men following close behind. The crowd slowly broke apart, some muttering in disappointment, others shaking their heads. But a few looked at the sheriff with new eyes, as if seeing a man who was willing to stand against the tide. Carver knew the town was divided now. Some would support him quietly, others would turn against him openly. His choice had put him on dangerous ground. Inside the jail, Naya spoke softly. "You have taken the first step." Carver turned to her. "The first step toward what?" "Toward freedom," she said simply. That night, Carver could not rest. He sat across from Naya's cell, and for the first time, he asked her to tell him about herself. At first she was silent, but then slowly she began to speak. She told him her name again, Naya, and that she had been taken while gathering water for her people. She explained that the raid Harlan accused her of had been led by others, and she had not been part of it. Her family had suffered losses too, driven from their lands, forced to move again and again. As she spoke, her voice was steady, filled with sorrow but also pride. She spoke of the mountains where her people once lived, the rivers that gave them life, the songs they sang by firelight. She spoke of how the earth was not something to own, but something to respect. Carver listened, his heart heavy. He realized how little he truly understood about the people who lived in the desert, long before his own town had been built. When she finished, he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "You shouldn't even be here," he said quietly. "This isn't justice." Naya met his gaze. "Then why do you keep me here?" Carver had no answer. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark town. He thought of his father's words again. A man's worth is not measured by the laws he follows, but by the truth he upholds when no one is watching. He realized the time for watching was over. The time for action had come. By dawn, Carver had made his choice. He unlocked the drawer of his desk and pulled out a set of keys. His hands trembled slightly as he walked to the cell. Naya rose slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You know what this means?" he asked. "I know what it means for me," she answered. "But what does it mean for you?" Carver drew in a deep breath. "It means I stop serving Harlan and start serving justice. Whatever it costs. With that, he turned the key and opened the cell door. The chains fell away with a dull clink. For the first time, Naya stood free, though the danger was far from over. Carver knew the moment the town learned she was gone, Harlan would send every man he had to hunt them down. Still, as Naya stepped out of the cell, there was a quiet strength in the room. She stood taller, her presence filling the small office with something larger than fear. Carver felt a weight lift from his chest, though another heavier one took its place. The knowledge that his life would never be the same. "Come on," he said. "We have to move before the town wakes." Together they slipped out the back door of the sheriff's office into the cool dawn air. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the first rays of the sun peeking over the desert hills. Carver saddled 2 horses quickly, handing one to Naya. She climbed on with ease, her posture proud. As they rode out of town, the streets still quiet, Carver cast one last look over his shoulder. The wooden buildings, the dusty road, the people he had sworn to protect. All of it seemed smaller now, swallowed by the shadow of Harlan's greed. He knew he was leaving behind not just his job, but his old life. But as the horses carried them into the open desert, the rising sun at their backs, Carver felt a strange calm settle over him. For the first time in days, he felt he had chosen truth. For the first time in years, he felt free. The desert stretched wide and endless before them, glowing under the pale light of early morning. Sheriff Carver and Naya rode swiftly, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust. The town behind them grew smaller with each passing mile, until it was just a smudge against the horizon. Carver didn't look back much, he didn't need to. He knew that once Harlan discovered Naya was gone, men would come after them. The land was harsh, filled with sharp rocks, dry brush, and gullies carved by rains that rarely came. But to Naya it seemed familiar. She rode with ease, her back straight, her eyes scanning the land as if reading a map only she could see. Carver noticed it and felt a strange mix of relief and worry. She belonged out here, while he was just a man with a badge who had stepped off the path he'd always walked. For hours, they rode in silence, broken only by the sound of wind and hooves. Finally, as the sun climbed higher, Carver slowed his horse. "We'll need water," he said. Naya nodded toward the distant hills. "There is a stream that runs through there. If we follow the rocks, we'll find it." They turned their horses in that direction, and true enough, after some time they reached a trickle of water running cool and clear over smooth stones. Carver dismounted and let his horse drink. He splashed water on his face, washing away the sweat and dust. Naya knelt by the stream, cupping water into her hands. For a moment, the chase and danger seemed far away, but Carver knew better. He knew Harlan's pride would not let this go. "They'll come," he said quietly. "It's only a matter of time." Naya looked up at him, her expression calm. "Then we must be ready." By afternoon, Carver's fear became reality. From the ridge behind them, the faint glimmer of sunlight flashed on rifles. Riders were coming fast, a trail of dust rising in the distance. Harlan's men had found them. Carver's pulse quickened. He swung into his saddle. "Ride." The 2 of them spurred their horses into motion, galloping hard across the desert. The chase began. The sound of pounding hooves echoed against the rocky ground. The shouts of men carried on the wind. Carver's heart pounded as he steered his horse through gullies and over ridges, each turn chosen to throw off the men behind them. Naya stayed close, her horse moving gracefully as if it knew the land by heart. She pointed toward a cluster of jagged rocks in the distance. "There. We can lose them there." They pushed harder, reaching the rocks just as the riders closed in. Bullets cracked through the air, echoing off stone. Carver pulled his horse behind a boulder, leaping down and pulling his rifle free. Naya followed, crouching low. The hired guns fanned out, circling the rocks. Dust swirled around them as they shouted threats. Carver fired a warning shot, the sound echoing across the desert. "Back off!" he shouted, but the men only laughed. One called out, "You can't run forever, Sheriff. Hand her over and maybe we'll let you live." Carver's grip tightened on his rifle. He knew they were lying. Harlan wanted him punished as much as he wanted Naya captured. Still, hearing those words only strengthened his resolve. The first of Harlan's men rushed forward, firing. Chips of stone exploded near Carver's head. He ducked low and returned fire, forcing the man to dive for cover. Naya, though unarmed, moved quickly, gathering stones and hurling them with surprising force to distract their attackers. She was not helpless, and her determination gave Carver courage. The fight dragged on, smoke and dust filling the air. Carver's shots were careful, meant to drive the men back rather than kill. He didn't want bloodshed, but he knew he had no choice but to fight. The attackers grew frustrated, shouting curses, but they did not quit. At last, Naya tugged on Carver's arm. "There is a path through the rocks," she whispered. "They do not know it. Follow me." Trusting her, Carver slung his rifle and followed as she led the way through a narrow gap hidden by brush. Their horses followed, pushing through the tight space. Behind them, the men shouted in confusion, unable to find the trail. By the time they emerged on the other side, the sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the desert. They rode hard again, not stopping until the orange glow of evening settled over the land. Finally, they reached a small canyon where the walls rose high and the floor was cool. Here they stopped to rest, hidden from sight. Carver leaned against the canyon wall, chest heaving. Sweat dripped down his face, but his eyes were bright with determination. "We bought some time," he said. "But they'll keep coming." Naya sat across from him, her posture steady despite the long ride. "Yes, but you chose to fight. You chose not to give me up." Carver met her gaze. "I couldn't, not after what I've seen." "You're not what they say you are." She gave a small nod. "And you are not what they say you are either." Her words struck him deeply. All his life he had been the lawman, the man who kept order. But now he was something else, someone willing to risk it all for the truth. For the first time, he felt like he was truly serving justice, not just the law. Night fell and the desert grew quiet. Stars filled the sky, brighter than any lantern in town. The two of them sat by a small fire, careful to keep it low so it would not be seen. Carver shared dried meat from his pack, while Naya told him stories of her people, of hunts, of songs, of the way they followed the stars. Her voice was steady, soft, carrying a rhythm that reminded him of the wind through the canyons. As he listened, Carver felt something stir in him. Respect, admiration, and a sense of peace he had not known in years. For once he was not the sheriff and she was not the prisoner. They were simply two souls bound by circumstance, fighting against a world that wanted to break them. But even in that quiet, Carver knew danger still lurked. Harlan would not stop. The man's pride was too great, his greed too deep. Tomorrow would bring another chase, another fight. Carver did not know how long they could keep running. Still, as he lay down under the stars, his rifle close at hand, he felt a strange calm. He had chosen this path, and he would not turn back. Naya slept nearby, her face peaceful, the firelight casting soft shadows. Carver watched her for a long time before closing his eyes. The desert night was cool, the stars endless, and in that moment, despite the danger, Sheriff Carver felt freer than he ever had before. The dawn broke slowly over the desert, its first light creeping into the canyon where Sheriff Carver and Naya had found shelter. The fire had long since died, leaving only ashes glowing faintly. Carver stirred from his light sleep, his hand instinctively finding the rifle at his side before he even opened his eyes. Years as a lawman had trained him that way. Always wake ready, always expect danger. He sat up, rubbing the dust from his eyes, and glanced at Naya. She was already awake, standing at the edge of the canyon floor, looking toward the horizon. Her figure was still and calm, as though she was a part of the land itself. The desert wind caught strands of her dark hair, carrying them gently across her face. Carver followed her gaze, but he saw nothing yet, only the endless sweep of red earth and rising sun. "They'll come today," she said quietly, not turning her head. Carver nodded. "I know." He stood and brushed the dirt from his coat, then walked to the stream that trickled along the canyon wall. He splashed his face, the cold water sharpening his thoughts. He knew the truth. They could not keep running forever. Harlan had too many men, too many resources. Sooner or later, they would be found. As the morning grew brighter, Carver saddled the horses. He tightened the straps carefully, his jaw set. "We should ride back," he said finally. Naya turned to him, surprised. "Back to the town?" Carver met her eyes. "Yes, if we keep running, they'll hunt us until we're worn down. Harlan will spread his lies and the people will believe him. But if we go back, if we stand there together, then maybe the truth can finally be seen. Maybe then it won't just be me protecting you. It'll be the people choosing what kind of law they want to live under." For a long moment, Naya said nothing. Then she nodded once. "You risk much, but you risk it for truth. I will go. By mid-morning, the two of them rode back toward town. The desert stretched wide, unforgiving, but Carver felt a strange calm. Every hoofbeat brought them closer to the place where everything would be decided. His future, her freedom, and the soul of the town itself. As they neared the outskirts, they could already see movement. Riders were gathered outside the town, waiting like wolves. Harlan's men spotted them first, shouting and pointing. Dust rose as more horses galloped forward, forming a loose ring to block their way. Carver pulled his horse to a stop, his rifle resting across his lap. He raised his voice. "Let us pass. We're going to the town." The men laughed, their eyes cold. One of them spat in the dirt. "The town doesn't want her. They want you to hand her over." Carver shook his head. "No, the town deserves to hear the truth, and they'll hear it today." At that moment, Harlan himself rode forward, his fine horse shining in the sunlight. His face was twisted in anger, his voice thick with scorn. "Carver, you fool. You've thrown away your badge, your honor. For what? For her? You think the people will stand with you? They'll turn on you the moment I tell them the truth." Carver's eyes burned with determination. "Your truth is built on lies, Harlan. You use fear to control them. But fear doesn't last forever. People remember courage longer than they remember fear." The two men stared at each other, the desert silent around them except for the restless snorting of horses. Finally, Harlan snapped his fingers and his men closed in. But Carver urged his horse forward, straight through the line, daring them to stop him. Naya followed close, her head held high. They rode into the town square, the people already gathering, drawn by the commotion. By the time they dismounted, a crowd had formed. Men, women, and children, their eyes wide with curiosity and unease. Carver stood tall, his rifle slung across his shoulder, his voice carrying strong. "Listen to me," he called. "You've been told this woman is guilty. You've been told she's dangerous. But I've spoken with her, I've heard her story. She was not part of the raids. She was taken while gathering water. She is not what Harlan says she is." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Some looked doubtful, others looked thoughtful. Harlan pushed his way through, his voice booming. "Don't listen to him. He's betrayed us. He's protecting the enemy. He's blinded by pity. If you let this Apache go free, it will be your homes, your families that pay the price." Shouts rose on both sides. Some townsfolk nodded at Harlan's words, fear in their eyes. But others looked at Carver with something new, respect. They had seen him stand against Harlan's men, seen him risk everything to protect one prisoner. That kind of courage could not be ignored. Carver raised his hand for silence. "You know me. I've been your sheriff for 10 years. I've upheld the law, kept the peace, protected this town. I've never turned my back on justice. And I tell you now, justice is not selling an innocent woman to line a rich man's pockets. Justice is standing for truth even when it's hard." His voice rang across the square. The people grew quiet, listening. Naya stepped forward then, her voice calm but strong. "I am not your enemy. My people have suffered, yes. But I have no wish to harm you. I only wish for freedom the same as you." Her words touched some hearts in the crowd. An older woman spoke first. "She's right. We've lost too much to hate already." Then a man added, "Sheriff Carver's always been fair. If he says she's not guilty, I believe him." The tide began to shift. More voices rose, not with anger, but with support. The townsfolk turned their eyes from Harlan to Carver, weighing the difference between fear and truth. Harlan saw it and grew desperate. His face turned red and he shouted, "Fools! You'll regret this. She'll destroy us all." He reached for his pistol, but before he could draw, Carver's rifle was already aimed. "Don't," Carver warned. His voice was steady, his finger firm on the trigger. For the first time, Harlan hesitated. His hand froze on the gun. Around him, the crowd grew still, watching. Carver lowered his rifle slowly, but kept his eyes locked on the land baron. "Your time of ruling through fear is over. Leave now before the people decide they've had enough of you." The crowd murmured in agreement. Harlan looked around, and for once he saw no support in their faces. Even those who feared him had grown tired of his greed. Finally, with a snarl, he spat on the ground and stormed away, his men following reluctantly. When the dust cleared, the town square erupted in voices. Some cheered, some simply breathed with relief. Carver felt the tension drain from his body. He turned to Naya, who stood proud and calm, her eyes shining with quiet strength. In that moment, Carver knew his life had changed forever. He had lost his badge. He could never again serve as the sheriff under Harlan's control. But he had gained something greater, honor, integrity, and the respect of people who now saw him not just as a lawman, but as a man of courage. Naya stepped closer. "You chose truth," she said softly. Carver nodded. "And I'd choose it again." The days that followed brought change. Naya returned to her people, carrying with her the story of a sheriff who chose to save rather than condemn. Carver stayed in the town for a while, no longer sheriff but no longer weighed down by the chains of false law. When people spoke of him, they no longer spoke of a man who enforced rules. They spoke of a man who upheld justice. And though the desert still stretched wide and harsh, though danger still lurked in its shadows, there was hope now. Hope that courage could outlast fear. Hope that truth could stand taller than lies. For Sheriff Carver and for Naya, the choice made in those desperate days would echo long after. He had saved her, but in a way she had saved him too. Saved him from a life of empty duty and reminded him of what justice truly meant. The desert winds carried their story far, and in time it became more than just the tale of a sheriff and an Apache woman. It became a lesson that when faced with the choice between fear and truth, a single act of courage could change everything.